Thinker on stage, Nietzsche's Materialism. Quoting Zarathustra's prologue, "By no means," said Zarathustra, "you have made danger your vocation. There is nothing contemptible in that. Now you perish of your vocation. For that I will bury you with my own hands." Chapter 1. Centauric Literature. Quoting Human All Too Human, "For this reason a higher culture must give to man a double brain, as if it were two brain ventricles, one for the perceptions of science, the other for those of non-science." The classic texts are those that survive their interpretations. The more they are dissected, the more elusive they seem. The more persistently they are wooed by the intellect, the more icily they stare past their transcendental suitors. And the deeper the forces of hermeneutical interpretive illumination and philological reconstruction penetrate the fabric woven by the classical text, the more adamantly that text resists the impact of interpretation. It is enough to explain the preponderance of the classical texts over their interpretations by stating that the successors of genius are always incapable of keeping up with it, or that it is impossible for commentators to exhaust the essence of the original. Perhaps 100 years ago, when the humanities were in their infancy, it was still possible to believe that the resistant nature of the great texts could be accounted for in this way. A naive hermeneutics of this type was at home during a period in which the classical authors hovered, like secular gods, above those who had been born after them, kept aloft in an aura of heroic inaccessibility by an ardently worshipping culture. Their works lent credibility to the claim that their interpreters, as the professional ministrants of the intellect, waved their incense burners over the classical texts so as to translate the eternal truths contained therein into pared down formulas that could be understood from the limited perspective of their own times. This is not the case today. The interpreter no longer approaches the classical texts like a believer going to Mass. The philological sciences have long since grown tired of their crypto-theological service to pedantic literalism. It has become increasingly more difficult for interpreters to believe that they have a mission of any sort, and to compile their commentary on the classical writers in the name of the eternal intellect. Instead of plunging to whatever solemn depths to find the true significance of tradition, they have increasingly withdrawn into a methodologically refined indifference toward all the usual pretensions of the intellect. A text is there, and we are here. We stand like cold-blooded barbarians before a classical find, Fundsache, indifferent to the core, perplexedly turning it over in our hands. Was it still good for anything? In any case, we can no longer presume on an a priori belief in the vital significance of the eminent text. At the utmost, this significance is revealed only when an ambitious, critical ego wants to make use of the material to improve itself, or when, because of a topical interest, a useful quotation is pulled at random from a historical source. And yet the drama is just now beginning, for it is precisely whenever disillusionment has done its job, and the succeeding generation of the intelligentsia, whether it has grown more mature or more cynical, it is in any case more moderate and sceptical, has learned to live with what it has inherited, that what is of consequence in the great texts is revealed. I'll read that again without the parenthesis. And yet the drama is just now beginning, for it is precisely whenever disillusionment has done its job and the succeeding generation of the intelligentsia has learned to live with what it has inherited, that what is of consequence in the great texts is revealed. Just when everyone has stopped believing in them, they begin to speak to us in a new voice. When they are no longer given credit for meaning anything, they begin to enrich us in the most surprising way. When we have decided that they have no significance for us, they unobtrusively begin to reach out towards us. And just when we think that we have finally turned our backs on them and rid ourselves of them once and for all, they begin, slowly but irresistibly, to trail along behind us. Not like persecutors or meddling teachers, but like inconspicuous ancestors and tutelary spirits, with whose generosity and discretion we are no longer accustomed to reckoning. When we have decided to concern ourselves henceforth only with our own particular problems and are ready to indulge in existential reductionism and shake off all too excessive burden of it all, it is then that we discover the voices of the classical authors in the midst of what remains. An indispensable phrase here, a beautiful passage there, occasionally the stirrings of a kindred spirit. Scattered everywhere, there are the fragments of a vocabulary, Wortschatz, that we find ourselves unable to relinquish precisely when we have decided to deal only with our own affairs and to withdraw from the din of the media, the institutions, and the barrage of estranged information with which they bombard us. Thus we are able to arrive at Nietzsche today. He should be read within this context. We must reckon with this new presence and acknowledge it as that of an author who is being allowed to return because he has been dismissed, and as that of a thinker upon whom we have stumbled because the subjects he deals with, even after the clean-up, are themselves still present, annoying, brilliant, stimulating, theatrical, and in every respect as unresolved as our own. And in doing so, we need not pay the least attention to the official status of his thought, and to the dubiousness of his ranking as a classical writer. It is too late to be racking our brains over whether Nietzsche, of all people, should have been elevated to the status of a classical writer, and whether he, as a man and a thinker, was the right choice to have been carried on the shoulders of an army of interpreters into the pantheon of thought. The history of reception does not, for the most part, trouble itself with the varying degrees of historical and human greatness. And thus Nietzsche has become a classical author because of a strange mixture of admiration and inaccuracy, even though in this case this has long since ceased to be the well-balanced classicism of bourgeois high culture, but is instead the wild classicism of the modern period, with its dark criticisms and its burning disangelia. Nevertheless, it has become common practice when discussing Nietzsche to remark that there are thinkers whose works can be studied independently of their biographies, and those whose life history and the development of their thought form an impenetrable unity. Nietzsche is said to belong to this latter category. We perceive in this platitudinous concept a trace of the injustice that has been done to an author by comparing him to the classical authors. Nietzsche has not been mystified to quite that extent. His greatness has nothing to do with his being dead. even if we disregard for the moment the almost inhuman brilliance of his later prose. Nietzsche's contemporary and mutilated aura has nothing in common with the irritating tone and noble boredom that are otherwise so often part of the classical climate. But what is it that makes Nietzsche so contemporary now? Indeed, so contemporary that even the admonitions that were raised against his teachings are once again notorious. What has made him once again questionable, quotable, exemplary? Is it simply that our latest neuroses are in search of a philosophical protector? Or could it be that, after decades of dealing with socialist liberal and born-again moralism, our zeitgeist is again clamouring for harder truths or enchanting removal of restraints? Has our pervasive doubt in the possibility of progress brought us to the point of needing alternative explanations for the phenomena of the modern period? Explanations that create a distance between us and the monsters of history and phantoms of socialization? None of these assumptions is completely incorrect, but they cannot explain why it is Nietzsche's name that always comes to mind whenever we attempt to come to terms with the deepest self-doubt of the modern period, and to make intellectual sense of the most difficult ambiguities of the present. Before we delve deeper into one of the great texts of this author, I would like to suggest a hypothesis on the nature of Nietzsche's writing. Accordingly, his new presence could be explained not so much through his undeniable cultural, critical, psychological, and philosophical competence, the illuminative power of which is still apparent, but through a weakness that touches us more irresistibly than any strength. If Nietzsche is, as it were, still among us, it is less because of the advantages he has over us today than because of the inabilities he has in common with us. Nietzsche's most prophetic characteristic was his inability to be a specialist in any one discipline. He never allowed himself to be content with doing anything in a manner that was merely professionally correct. He never managed simply to do what was expected of him. Not that he would have been unable to meet the standards of any of the disciplines he pursued. The opposite was the case. Nietzsche's misery began and ended in the fact that he could never be satisfied with pursuing one and only one subject in accordance with the established rules of the art. Certainly, he did do this to an extent in that he was Certainly, he did do this to an extent in that he was undoubtedly an exceptional philologist, an astute critic of his own times, and a profound analyst of morals, among other things. But whenever he pursued any one of these disciplines, quote-unquote, correctly, indeed he was more than correct, he always practiced at least one other at the same time, and because of this was suspected of a general incorrectness. It may therefore appear at first glance as if in his public life Nietzsche had fallen victim to his own double gifts. His almost inexplicable lack of success during his own lifetime may have resulted from this. A lack of success for which his helpless capriciousness in dealing with his publishers is an insufficient explanation, as may have the explosive posthumous effect of his work. While any one of his talents taken on its own and developed to a professional level would have been sufficient for a respectable career, Nietzsche's career as a philologist indicated this, the combination of talents this man possessed caused him to lead the life of an obscure outsider on the fringes of organised cultural life. To speak of a combination here is incorrect, since Nietzsche's was not a case of the familiar phenomenon of multiple talents. In truth, Nietzsche's talents were not a collection of abilities that developed side by side. His talents were not really separate from one another and did not simply coexist. It was much more than that. In each instance, one talent functioned through another, so that he was not, like many artists, simultaneously an artist and a musician, a poet and a philosopher, a producer and a theoretician, and so on, but rather a musician as writer, a poet as philosopher, and a producer as theoretician. He did not practice the one discipline alongside the other, but practiced the one by practicing the other. Nietzsche has taxed his audience with this plastic entwinement of his languages and talents up to the present. No one has played as wicked a game with the appearance of being easily comprehended as he has. Nietzsche can by no means be understood by relying simply on what is there in black and white, and whatever else can be learned from a synopsis of the contents. Nietzsche's fascist readers were, and remain, those who prove to be massively boorish when dealing with the content, unable to comprehend his great game beyond semantics, his post-metaphysical music of gestures, Gebärdenmusik. The only reader who will ultimately be able to approach Nietzsche's undertaking will be the one who sees what this many-stringed, displaced, finely tuned author is really about when he puts something down on paper. Thomas Mann correctly noted that he who took Nietzsche literally, in the sense of remaining fixated on content and semantic reduction, was lost. Nietzsche himself was acutely aware of the indirect and mixed elements in his writing, and during his lifetime he was never willing to put aside the opinion that he was a composer who had been mistakenly driven to literature. He also sometimes thought of himself as a poor devil who had been driven away from humanity into the realm of acrobatic divinity. Quote, "Only a fool, only a poet." End quote. During the period of his greatest self-confidence, he experienced himself as an expressive, total phenomenon that was being evaluated only by Philistines who used the usual literary, philological, and philosophical standards of measurement. He saw himself as a philosophizing counterpart to Richard Wagner, whose aesthetic demon was also not satisfied to express itself through a single genre, and who therefore came upon the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork, a symbolic arrangement using multiple media and synesthesia through which he wanted to place himself totally in the limelight. Nietzsche's originality is evident in the fact that he developed a literary staging process that had to make do without Wagner's operatic synesthesia. He had to trust his project entirely to writing, without this project being only literary in nature. Early on, friends and colleagues who were close to him realized that other forces were also at work within the psyche of the great stylist, musical and prophetic energies, Caesarean and religion-founding impulses, psychagogic, pedagogic, reformative and artistically demagogic drives. Nietzsche himself developed a minor theory of displaced talents vis-a-vis Wagner, and shrewdly noted that there was something of the actor in Wagner's natural disposition that, for lack of an appropriate stage for his outrageous pretensions, spilled over into the idea of creating his own universe in the music drama. But whereas Wagner, through constant self-expansion, transformed himself from rebellious composer into a composing cultural reformer, Nietzsche, quote, as a philologist and man of words, end quote, had to compress the entire spectrum of his impulses into the narrow medium of writing. Thus we arrive at Nietzsche's first work, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. It is obligatory reading for anyone who seeks to maintain the ties between his life and the art of making sure that it will be impossible for him ever to become simply a scholar. This art, nota bene, is not a second-choice discipline for failed scholars, stolid philologists, or flabbergasted philosophers. On the contrary, the text is a matter of philosophie et demie, of a philology with wings, and of a scholarly discipline that has risen to the level of genuine philosophical reflection through objective material intensity. As will be shown, the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music represents at the same time the birth of the gay science out of the spirit of excess, even if this gay science might still appear here replete with all of Nietzsche's adolescent pleasure in being serious. The phenomenon must be understood in context. In 1869, and at the age of 25, without having published anything previously, Nietzsche was offered the chair in classical philology at the University of Basel solely on the basis of the recommendation of his teacher, Friedrich Ritschl, the so-called Pope of the Leipziger philologists. And thanks to a generously unbureaucratic gesture on the part of the authorities, in his letter of recommendation, Ritschl evaluated his candidate as follows: "Never yet have I known a young man, or tried to help one along in my field as best I could, who was so mature as early and as young as this Nietzsche. If, God grant, he lives long enough, I prophesy that he will one day stand in the front rank of German philology. He is the idol, and without wishing it, the leader of the whole younger generation of philologists here in Leipzig, who cannot wait to hear him as a lecturer. You will say I describe a phenomenon. Well, that is just what he is, and at the same time pleasant and modest, and also a gifted musician, which is irrelevant here." Ritschl was mistaken on the last point. Nietzsche's musical nature had more to do with his existence as a philologist than his teacher was willing to admit in his moving and yet descriptive recommendation for the outsider without credentials. What Ritschl characterized as irrelevant within the context of the procedure for making the appointment proved immediately to be the one element essential to Nietzsche's existence in Basel. Ritschl had instinctively understood that Nietzsche was a phenomenon, but he did not understand what was at the core of that phenomenon, Nietzsche's musical and theoretical double nature. By musical I do not mean only that he composed and played music in the narrower sense. Rather, the whole troubled mass of what was grandiose and inexpressible at work within the young philologist must be included here, as must be the compulsiveness and urgent drive towards self-expression that made his life ambitious and overconfident, indeed pregnant with ambition. Here we must also include the desire to be heard contained in his prophetic and reform-minded voices, behind which, without engaging in evasive diagnosis or unobtrusive psychologizing, one can hear the voice of Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, the father he idealized, a Protestant minister who died young and whom he missed. Of course, the general elements in Nietzsche's case could be trivialized under the heading, "The Rectory releases its children," or "If we wake up to find that we have been too well trained." In any case, music was already very much present in the first scholarly attempts of the newly appointed professor. His encounter with Wagner loosened the tongue of the scholar of letters. The musician began to perform through the instrument of philology. What this over-gifted scholar had appropriated from Schopenhauer, Wagner and the Greeks was this precise sensitivity to the modern resonances of antiquity, to the metaphysical content of music, and to the tragic greatness of the outsider. Here, in the first literary undertaking by the phenomenal scholar, all of these motifs sounded together for the first time in a great rhetorical orchestration. His centauric talent was in the process of discovering its own language, or, better put, its own languages. Nietzsche's debut, a debut as brilliant as it was his Nietzsche's debut, a debut as brilliant as it was catastrophic, took place under these auspices in the winter of 1871-72. Its brilliance has become part of cultural history, as we are reminded in editions of his works. Its catastrophic element was to a great extent due to the fact that Nietzsche's vision of the birth of Greek tragedy contained more than most well-meaning readers could have expected from it, even more than the author himself had dared to realise at that stage in his development. The famous self-critical preface of 1886 sheds some light on the reason for this, and at the same time conceals it, because the later Nietzsche no longer wanted to acknowledge the superior, even though less manly, elements of his earlier work. Its brilliance as a stylistic achievement notwithstanding, this self-criticism is a hypocritical one, because in it, the truth of the earlier Nietzsche, his insight into primordial pain, Urschmerz, is stifled by the quote-unquote truth of his later work, the thesis on the will to power. This will remind us almost unavoidably of the analogous development in Freud, who sacrificed the truth of his earlier theory of seduction to the later quote-unquote truth of the theory of instinct. Given the circumstances, a test of Nietzsche's talents was certainly appropriate. Nothing was more understandable than the author's need to prove that his appointment over better qualified applicants not only reflected a fairy tale privilege, but was also objectively justified by the genuine superiority of the extraordinary scholar and thinker. What was called for then was self-representation, proof of his superiority, the corroboration of an academic rank that had been too easily won. He wanted more. He could do more. But at his first opportunity to dazzle the general reading public, he immediately extended the oppressive excess of his vision beyond what was demanded by his subject. That he did this is still baffling 100 years after the fact. Who was really interested in the details of how Greek tragedy might have developed? Who, except for a few philologists of antiquity, who were not interested in much else, would get excited about ancient he-goat choruses and the conjectured states of the souls of Attic theatre-goers during Dionysian performances? Nietzsche must be credited for the fact that such obdurate lay questions no longer have to be seriously posed today. Because of his genial intervention, which intended in part to inspire philology and in part to force it to extend beyond itself, he made sure that the philosophical and psychological concerns of humanity could develop from out of the specialized concerns of philology, if one can use the term humanity within the context of current discourse without blushing. It has often been remarked that Nietzsche's first book was at bottom simply a long conversation with Richard Wagner, a wooing of his fatherly friend and an ecstatic projection of himself into Wagner's heroic, immortalized dominion of art. Indeed, it is impossible to imagine the birth of tragedy without Wagner's influence, beginning with the ominous pairing of the gods Apollo and Dionysus, with whom Wagner had already been operating pro domo, and then continuing from the critique of the classical opera to the idea of a new German Renaissance under the sign of a Wagnerian art of redemption. Nietzsche once made the coquettish observation that Wagner could have written the book better himself. And yet, understanding what influenced it does not grasp the phenomenon that came to fruition in the birth of tragedy. You can add together the Wagnerianism, the Schopenhauerian metaphysics, and the elements from classical philology in any way you will, and never come up with Nietzsche's result. For whatever the combination of sources and prototypes, the decisive element in it was the Centauric birth. That is, the setting loose of an infinitely consequential, artistic, and philosophical double-natured eloquence within which Nietzsche's powers were bound together effectively for the first time. Only someone who has long since left his imagined audience behind him can write like this. Someone who is no longer concerned with whether his actual audience will understand him. This would explain Nietzsche's somnambulistic self-assuredness in committing such a professional faux pas. In spite of his esoteric bravado, he was preaching to the heights, which were inhabited by his high, great, kindred spirits, and woe to those who were not comfortable at those heights. Quote, "God have mercy on my philologists if they don't want to learn anything," end quote, wrote Nietzsche in the letter that accompanied the edition dedicated to Wagner in January of 1872. It was to be expected that the word megalomania would sooner or later be used in reaction to such high-blown mannerisms. Indeed, Ritschl was the first to use it. In contrast to this, Wagner reacted enthusiastically. According to Cosima Wagner, the maestro wept with joy when he read the young professor's book. This is not hard to believe if we remind ourselves that Wagner was merely reading the mirror image of his own thoughts in Nietzsche's words, and did not stop to consider that this kind of mirroring might also represent a provocation from a different sort of confident awareness of self. There can be no doubt that Nietzsche himself thought this, and that he was attempting to understand his own development from the perspective of the dialectic of the divestment and finding of the self. In honouring the other man, he recognised an essential component of the process of liberating himself. Shortly after the publication of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche expressed his obstinate opposition to total absorption in the cult of Wagner through an essay on the theory of competition in antiquity. That is the core of the Hellenic notion of the contest. It abominates the rule of one and fears its dangers. It desires, as a protection against the genius, another genius. Every talent must unfold itself in fighting. That is the command of Hellenic popular pedagogy. This cult of genius, genialismus, its curious and offensive aspects notwithstanding, will take on added significance with respect to psychology in our further deliberations. During Nietzsche's time, any engendering of centaurs was possible only within the context of a genial, artistic, quote-unquote, everything is permitted climate, which later gave birth to these centaurs. These doubly destructive images from art and theory, stimulating fusions of the fundamental and the accidental. Even in 1870, after he had accepted the position at Basel and had, under the liberating influence of Wagner, made his first rhetorical attempts at a philology inspired by the spirit of reform, Nietzsche was able to express a presentiment of centauric literary tendencies. He wrote at this time to Erwin Rohde, "Scholarship, art and philosophy are growing together inside me to such an extent that one day I'm bound to give birth to centaurs." Only from behind the pretense of the cult of genius was Nietzsche able to defend himself publicly from his profession's demands that he limit his self-expression to topics that were customary within the profession, and that he deal privately with the so-called existential remainder. The genial mannerisms of the author can therefore be understood as indication of an understandable lack of willingness, and as manifestations of an endearing incapacity. The willingness to mutilate himself academically, and the inability to be the sort of scholar who is interested in nothing outside of his own narrow specialization. Now, it would seem as obvious as it would be misleading to understand Nietzsche's literary centaurs within the context of the essay form, and to thereby dismiss the drama of civilization that is hidden behind a reduction to genre definition by means of a prescribed phraseology, however generous it may be. The term essay itself has a cockeyed ring to it. It sounds almost like a plea for leniency in the face of insufficient intellectual powers. Its open form, its laxity in constructing an argument, the rhetorical liberties it takes, and the quote-unquote vacation it allows one from the task of having to provide evidence to support one's conclusions. All of this would point to mitigating circumstances. We are usually only able to associate such laxity with regression, and such liberties with a lapse. To the extent that the same types of tension release mechanisms must coexist alongside a stringent intellectualism, close bracket, the intellect that is dominated by professionalism and seriousness must concede the existence of a proviso that it calls, quote-unquote, the essay, wherein one does not have to be so particular. But this is not at all true in Nietzsche's writing. When he lets himself go, the level of quality increases. When he opens the floodgates of his mind, the claims he makes are radicalized. When he follows his whims, the discipline becomes more than it was. For this reason, Nietzsche's centaurs consistently take the wrong step, and thereby proceed upward. The problem that begins to make itself apparent here is so extensive that it would seem justifiable to attempt to reformulate it. Might it not be true that within the framework of an integrated existence, whatever that might be, knowledge of the world and self-expression belong close together? Closer in any case than they are usually found to be under modern-day conditions. Has not the division of the labour of talent that characterises our times led to the tendential opposition of the psychic attitudes that capacitate scientifically oriented knowledge to the expression of the self, while those that accommodate self-expression betray a propensity that is hostile to knowledge? Are not the cults of science and aesthetics the prototypical, complementary idiots of modernity? And under such conditions, must not the relationship between a cognitive modernity, as has been organised within the scope of science and technology, and an aesthetic modernity, as has been established within the arts today, be strained to the breaking point? Should we not instead perhaps simply speak of a relationship that is openly hostile? If the situation is indeed as these questions imply, what are the ramifications for an individual who, contrary to the spirit of the times, still believes in the Goethean idea of a double intellect, which is simultaneously artistic and scientific? What happens to those naive, intense individuals who from the start have not understood that the modern promises of totality are nothing less than a swindle, pure and simple? How are those enthusiastic temperaments who are not quite up to the current standards for cynicism and intellectual dismemberment supposed to manage? With reference to the author of The Birth of Tragedy, I ask, did the young Nietzsche drink his fill of Fortenser humanism, the Schopenhauerian pathos of asceticism, and the Wagnerian cult of genius, so that in his own professional and journalistic endeavours he could submit to the demands of the division of intellectual labour and allow himself to be restricted by the political tactics expected by his profession? The whole man must move at once. Nietzsche could have chosen this adage from Addison, which Lichtenberg had once recorded approvingly in his notebook as his own motto. Man must express himself as a whole self. Perhaps Nietzsche's acute penetration into current intellectual sensibilities can be attributed to the fact that he reminds us of an unrelinquished dream of modernity. He succeeded, albeit at a high price, in being an artist as scholar-scientist, and a scholar-scientist as artist. What we find so fascinating in this today is not the audacity of this solution, but rather its obviousness. And yet, with his effortlessly effective double-natured observations as a scholarly scientific aesthetician and an aesthetic scholar-scientist, he found himself caught in the position of representing an unclassifiable curiosity, which is at home nowhere because it could not belong anywhere. From this eccentric position, Nietzsche called attention to what was a cultural and psychological scandal and an aberration of perceptions. The fact that what is obvious to any impartial intelligence is marvelled at as representing something exceptional, and that what could not but spontaneously result from a healthy aversion to constriction was either celebrated or berated as exceeding a limit. In light of this, we can remove Nietzsche's obsession with genius from his successors without hesitation. What at one time could perhaps be accomplished only through the aristocratic pose of the cult of genius comes off today by way of an imperturbable lack of respect for limits. In the meantime, we no longer need even a super clever theory of deprofessionalization in order to resist scientogenous specialists and the non-intellectual spiritlessness of the division of intellectual labour. Resistance of this sort does not require any sort of expertise. Of what use is critical theory if vigilance is enough? But it is, in an outstanding way, a literary virtue. In order to be able to consider the current deficiencies in critical theories as a loss, we must perhaps simply cease. In order to be able to consider the current deficiencies in critical theories as a loss we can easily afford, we must perhaps simply cease to conceive of literature as a separate aesthetic world that, because of its specific characteristics, Besonderheit, has become a speciality in itself, and with this merely a new pigeonhole. Perhaps literature is simply, in the broadest sense, the universal element within the Centauric phenomenon. It would in that case be the lingua franca for free spirits, for those who cross the borders between spheres that shift away from each other, and for defenders of coherence. There have been sufficient indications for a long time now that this is true. Always, whenever authors inspire a dual perspective through their own polylingualism, there comes into play the literary general eloquence of intelligent minds, who seem to see the only value in limits as lying in the fact that these limits afford us the opportunity to exceed them. From E.T.A. Hoffmann to Sigmund Freud, from Søren Kierkegaard to Theodore W. Adorno, from Novalis to Robert Musil, from Heinrich Heine to Alexander Kluge, from Paul Valéry to Octavio Paz, from Bertolt Brecht to Michel Foucault, and from Walter Benjamin to Roland Barthes. In each instance, the most communicative minds have presented themselves as temperaments and variations of the centauric genius. whatever is at stake in the birth of tragedy, the appearance of this archetypal centauric writing took place within a conspicuous cultural vacuum, and was met by an astonishing silence on the part of the public. According to them, the book was merely a private incident, a footnote to the Wagner cult. There was isolated readers who sensed that something promising was at work in this little book. But in general, its immediate effect was to make its author appear to be, quote, dead as far as his profession was concerned, end quote, in the words of Professor Usener of Bonn. But even those who sensed in this dense, moving opusculum the element that was rich in potential for the future would have been hard-pressed to comment on what it was about. Only later, when Zarathustra had won Nietzsche worldwide stature, did what he intimated become clear. Nietzsche had constructed for himself a cultural stage upon which more than a Bayreuth Renaissance was to be played out. It was a stage for exceptional disclosures, for cultural re-evaluations of the most menacing sort, and for an unheard-of breakthrough into humanism by psychodynamics. The centauric philologist, who those around him expected would, devoted as he was to antiquity, carry on the cult of individuality of Weimar in Greece, raised the curtain on a stage upon which the bourgeois individual had to abandon himself to the most dangerous, and at the same time most probable disillusionment. Suddenly, Greek antiquity was no longer a faithful mirror for humanistic self-stylization, nor a guarantee for reasonable moderation and proper bourgeois serenity. In one stroke, the autonomy of the classical subject was done away with. From above and from below, from the numinous and the animal realms, impersonal powers broke into the standardized form of the personality and turned it into a tumbling mat for dark and violent energies. An instrument for anonymous universal forces. Although, within the history of bourgeois culture, enthusiasm for Greece had consistently functioned as a key component in the makeup of the individual, with classical philology as the institutional support mechanism for the humanistic cult of personality, the most disquieting subversion of modern belief in the autonomy of the subject now arose from this, the most established of all disciplines. Well, little wonder then that his colleagues anxiously restrained themselves. Only one man made the leap from embarrassment to outrage, re-stylizing and transforming his unwillingness to understand into a condescending, I know better attitude. This was Ulrich von Wilamowitz Mullendorf, a doctoral candidate with the glib tongue of a professor who defended his academic inheritance before he had mastered it. Actually, he later made his career within the framework of the values he had attempted to protect from Nietzsche's subversion. The term philology of the future, which Wilamowitz had coined to use against Nietzsche's book, a contemptuous reference to the Wagnerian art of the future, was a term of derision that became a prophecy. But not, to be sure, in the sense that Nietzsche's essay would point the way for the future study of classical languages and cultures. This term of mockery became true enough in the inversion of its meaning. Philological studies did not become more vital. Rather, what was vital became more informed by philology. Through Nietzsche, a philology of the future was generated that, in an unprecedented manner, inquired into the correspondences between existence and language.